my only white slide. I apologize again for people in the front. The rest is dark, dark. Okay, I've actually used this before. This is from Martin Fowler's blog post on test doubles, and it categorizes the 5 different types of test doubles. And it's a bit academic, but I think it's gonna help us kind of lay a common vocabulary, build up these definitions, which we're gonna see as we get into these code samples. So we have dummy objects. These are passed around. They're not really used. They're just kind of like placeholder values. They're filling parameter lists and so forth. We have fakes, which are objects with actual implementations, but they take some kind of shortcut. So we're gonna use them for testing, not necessarily production. We also have stubs. That's a train, by the way. We also have stubs, which provide canned answers to calls that we're gonna make to them during tests, but they don't really respond to anything else. They're just gonna give you like null back, for example. We have spies, which are stubs, but they listen in and kind of record calls that were made to them, right? Spies, good name. And we have mocks, which are pre-programmed. They're the most extreme version of these spies and stubs because they're gonna throw an exception if they get a call that they do or do not expect. So we have mocks, we have spies, we have stubs, we have fakes, we have dummies, we have all this vocabulary, all this academia, all this dogma, which is creating, of course, this barrier to entry with testing because again, it gives you imposter syndrome. And to all that, I, of course, say, what the fake? And to the pun, I want to talk about fakes within Laravel, right? And really when I mention that, an alternative title for this could be, what the facade? Historically, facades have gotten a bad rap in Laravel, and there's a lot of different BS reasons out there, but the one that ever carried weight with me was that they were static and therefore they were a little bit difficult to test. But the reality is that hasn't been true since Laravel 5.0. That's like 9 years ago now, and it's even less true now with Laravel 10, almost a decade later. We're gonna see some of the modern fakes that are built in now. So, without further ado, let's get into the code. Imagine the classic blog application here. We have this post controller, and zooming in on this show action here, we have a post being injected through implicit model binding. We're gonna return a view, and we're gonna pass that post down to the view data. And if you're not familiar with testing, just to kind of level set here, nice enterprise word, we're going to have this as kind of our naive implementation of a test. And breaking this up again, we have this post factory here that we're gonna create a post with. Now again, you might think this is some kind of test object, it's some kind of fake or whatnot. And despite the name that's being used in the library, likely in your factory, faker, I would argue that this is actually dummy data, especially for this particular test case. We're not actually using any of the data that we're setting, they're just placeholder values to satisfy the database requirement. In fact, we're not even gonna use this post in any capacity for this test other than just simply it as an entity in memory. And what I mean by that is we're really only passing it here in our route. And it's not a mock request, it's not a fake request, it's not hitting a mock server. It's actually hitting your application top to bottom, from routes all the way to terminable middleware. Now it's not talking to you in HTTP, it's not using the protocol, instead you're getting this test response back. Again, a test object, but a real object, and it has assertions on it, which things like assert status 200 or assert OK, assert the view was a certain view, assert we got certain post data in that view. So dozens and dozens of helpers that make Laravel just really fun to test, to be honest, in my opinion. Okay, kid stuff. Let's move on to the more advanced things here. The store action, you know, the outer shell of this is pretty straightforward, but where we might get a little scared, where we might get a little complex, is this middle meaty area. We're doing things with the facade here, we're hitting the config, we're queuing stuff up, we're using that scary noob keyword there that all the testers kind of worry about, and we're using some syntactic sugar here to ultimately dispatch a job. So, let's test this. A naive approach might be something like this. Again, we're using that faker library to create some dummy data. We're firing off a post, and we're using some of the assertions within Laravel as well as PHP unit to make sure that this post is in the database, it's what we expect, and ultimately we got redirected. Now, unfortunately, when we run this test, we get a failure. What's kind of curious about this is the failure doesn't necessarily relate to the code that we just saw in that store action. What it relates to is the code that was actually run in the job. What's even more curious is what happened to that email? Did it go anywhere, right? I don't know. Well, the answers to both of these mysteries lies in the default PHP unit configuration that you get out of the box. So these two pieces of environment variable here, in this case the mail mailer, is by default set to an array. And this is just an in-memory object, right? It's an in-memory data structure, and it's just sending that mail off into kind of PHP land. It's not actually firing or using, so we're seeing no side effects from it. And because of that, it's not causing any issues for our test. The queue driver or queue connection, on the other hand, is set to synchronous, which means that our jobs are going to run immediately. That handle method is going to be executed, and ultimately that publish that date is getting set when we don't expect it to. Now we could set this to some kind of driver out of the box in Laravel, like null, which is a no-op, and it's just going to fire off those jobs into nowhere land, Nullsville, right? And if we ran our test again, it would pass. This is an option if you have legacy code or really tightly coupled code that's sending off mail or dispatching a bunch of jobs or events. You can do this so you can get started with testing. Nothing wrong with that. But I have 23 minutes, so let's have a better talk than that. Okay, digging into the store test that we were just on, zooming in kind of right before we do our action here, let's call mail fake. This is an actual method on the mail facade. If we core dive down into Laravel, we'll see a couple things here. We see the method, of course, but more importantly, we see this new mail fake instance. Fowler would be so proud of us. This is an actual implementation that's going to take shortcuts about how we're testing the application or how the mail facade is used. And we're swapping that out in the container so that way anytime we use the mail facade from now on in our test or our application, it's going to use this mail fake instead. Digging even deeper now into this mail fake itself and just kind of the highlighted structure here, we can see it has all the same methods that are on the mail facade, but it also gives us these assertion methods. So back to our test. After we've performed our action here of sending the request, we're going to make an assertion. In this case, assert queued, new post, and a callback that makes sure that that instance got the data we expected, in this case, that new post that was created, and it was also sent to the email address that we created. Those things came from the config values, for example. So, not so scary. And when we run our test, we see that's passing. That's pretty powerful, right? We're not just sending stuff off into nowhere anymore. We're actually controlling a huge feature within Laravel and making sure it's doing what we want it to do. That's, again, super powerful. But, of course, with great power comes great responsibility. Let's go back to our implementation, and let's fire off another mail message. Let's run our test suite again. It's still going to pass. Just like that driver we had a minute ago, and just like to the definitions that we read earlier, the fake isn't a real implementation. It's still just holding on to all of those calls. You're responsible for making the assertions on them. You're responsible for making sure that the application is behaving the way you want, but only the way you want. So let's go back to our test, and let's throw in another assertion. It's actually the same assertion, but instead of doing a callback, we can pass a single integer as the second argument. In this case, we can say, assert queued new post 1. This is going to make sure that only one of the new post mailable was queued. This is a step in the right direction, but for those that were super paying attention there a second ago, you'll see that I didn't actually queue that. I sent that message, so this isn't going to get us necessarily any farther. On top of which I could send other mail messages. There's 100 different ways we could end up breaking this, so let's do something a bit more broad. A newly added assertion here is assert outgoing count 1. So now we're saying the total number of mailables outgoing in the lifecycle of our test was 1. So combined with the assertion that we had before, if only one was outgoing, and it was the one that was queued the way we expected, then we can have total confidence that our code is behaving the way we want. So going back to our test with kind of that faulty implementation I just threw up there, we get a nice little error message here. It says the total number of outgoing mailables was 2 instead of 1. Perfect. That's a failure we would like to see. Now there's this concept sometimes in the Laravel community. It dates back, but it's called spell check or spell checky. We want to make sure that our code, is flexible, right? Our tests aren't so rigid that we can't change the implementation. And again, the origins of that was really more about the unit style testing versus integration style testing that we see in the Laravel framework now, which again is wonderful. I would argue in this case, especially with these fakes, because of the power that they have. Again, you want to make sure that you just add a couple of these assertions to make sure it's behaving the way you want, right? Be a little strict. I think that's okay. I think we would argue that if you're sending more email to your system or you're firing off more jobs, that's probably not something we want to happen. We would want to see this failure, right? It also gives us a nice hook in the future if we're practicing something like TDD to drive this out accordingly. All right, let's move on. Back to our original implementation here. We can kind of check the box with this mail facade. Let's move on to this review post dispatch. This is actually dispatching a job to the command bus, ultimately. So jumping back to our implementation, along with the mail fake here, we can say bus fake. You could actually say queue fake. I tend to use bus fake simply for the fact that within the Shift code base, I batch a lot of jobs, and those are done through the bus. So both of them have fake implementations that we've been looking at. Both of them have great assertions on them, but the bus is going to give you kind of the best of both worlds. So with that, we can have another assertion, in this case, assert dispatched, much like the mail assertion that we used a minute ago. We can say review post, the job class that we expect. We get a callback to make sure that that instance of that job got the post that we expected it to get. And when we run this, we're back to passing, but now we have, again, total confidence. And in fact, we have 100% code coverage for that store action. I don't necessarily think that matters, but we do, so if you care about that, you got it. All right, let's get deeper into our application here. We have this job, and inside of this, what's a little interesting here, what might be considered a bit complex, is the fact that we're dispatching another job. So we have a job that dispatches another job. Again, naive test for this might look something like this. And when we run this, we see a similar failure to what we saw before. We're getting that published at date being set. Just like in our controller action, this is set because that underlying job that we're now dispatching is ultimately setting that. So we know how to control this now. Let's go back to our test. We're going to add in this bus fake, and we're going to add in the assertion that that other job now was being dispatched from this job. Unfortunately, when I run this, we get a failure. It's a different failure, but we still get a failure. That published post job, or published post job, was not dispatched the way we expected. Now, we just looked at the implementation. That thing's definitely being sent off. So what's going on here? This was a pretty good head scratcher for me to Joel's talk earlier. I spent about half a morning figuring this out one time. But it's good to kind of reiterate this because, again, this bus fake is, well, preventing us from being able to dispatch this job. We're dispatching in our test to kind of make our code behave the way we want. But again, we call this bus fake, so it's just going to nowhere. It's getting recorded so we can make assertions on it, but it's not actually executing that handle method. So our underlying job isn't being fired. Now, you might think, as I did when I came across this, well, I'll just fire it off myself, all right? I'm going to new up this review post. I'm going to call the handle method. I'll resolve all those dependencies, and yeah, this will pass, but it is damn ugly, right? Anytime I come across stuff like this and I'm doing things like this, I'm kind of like rebuilding the framework in a way. I know that I'm doing something wrong. I kind of call this like fighting the framework. I don't want to fight the framework. I don't want to embrace the framework. So there's nothing wrong with dispatching this job the way we were dispatching it. This isn't where our problem is. You can write application code in your tests. That's okay, right? You can use Laravel in your test. We did that earlier with an eloquent query, for example. Totally fine. The problem, again, goes back to this responsibility. We are turning off the entire dispatching system inside of Laravel. So instead, what we can do here is we can control this a bit better by passing in an argument. In this case, we can say only fake the publish post job when it's dispatched. Only listen for that one. Alternatively, we can say fake everything except for the job that we want to dispatch from our test. Both of these are going to result in a passing test. So nice little gotcha there, and again, Laravel always to the rescue. Okay, let's look at that final job where we're actually setting at that published at to now, but more importantly, we're firing off an event. And this event is really using the event facade underneath, right? Despite all the new keywords and whatever else, we can test it in a similar way that we've been testing all this other stuff before. So moving a little bit faster here, going down into that test, we can see that we have the event fake. And just like before, we have an assertion that we can perform on it to make sure that the proper event's being fired with the proper data. Great. Okay, we got a good test suite. We're kind of getting things moving here. Let's go back and do a little refactoring, some true refactoring with our tests. This code that was in the middle here that we looked at earlier, we could argue probably belongs somewhere else, right? Anytime we create a post, we want this to happen. So posts aren't only going to be created in this controller, they could be created elsewhere in our application. So we could do things like Laravel actions and all sorts of other things, service classes and whatnot. But I think a good candidate, again, for this that the framework provides are events. So let's go deeper down the rabbit hole. Let's refactor this to be a little more event-driven, and we can do so in our post model with its model lifecycle events, in this case, the created event. So anytime the created event is, or happens for this particular model, we're gonna fire off this post-created event. And we can take that code that was in the controller and move it down into the listener, right? So anytime this is fired off, the listener is gonna catch that, and it's gonna send off the email and the job. When we run our entire test suite again, we get a couple failures. What's interesting here is that the code that we refactored, that controller, the failure is not happening there. That's still passing. So again, your knee-jerk reaction, as mine was the first time, was to think, okay, well, I didn't change code over here in this review post job. I only changed it in the controller, so not my fault, ship it. There's a problem here, so let's dig it down a little bit deeper. And it's a similar problem as we've seen before, but playing the game for a second, if we get down inside of our job, we can see here in the handle method, again, we're not creating a model, right? So like, what's going on here? Again, you might think, okay, well, I don't know what's happening here. I'm just going to disable this test. But it's actually the test where the issue is. And again, it wasn't obvious to me the first time I came across this, but I'm not like explicitly creating a model here, but I kind of am. Again, these are real objects at the end of the day, but for some reason in my head, I thought, factory, right? That's a testing thing, right? It's not actually my application. It's just kind of creating something somewhere else. But no, it's actually creating a model. Again, maybe it has dummy data or placeholder data, but it's actually creating a model, and therefore that lifecycle event is firing. So we might think, okay, well, I'm gonna reach for the event fake here, but again, heavy-handed requires responsibility. There's another way, of course, with Laravel. And I really like this. This is a method we can chain here on our factory, and it's called create quietly. It's a wonderfully named method, and what this is gonna do is when that factory is being created, it's gonna automatically disable the events that fire around that for us. So we don't have to go fake out the event and test anything like that. We can just use this create quietly if we know that our system has potential side effects with these model lifecycle events, right? If we put this in the right spot, we'll get back to a passing test suite. But there's an issue. We were using the event fake in one of our jobs, right? In fact, this job here. And it's still passing. And of course, again, you might think, great. It's not great. This is passing for the wrong reasons, and that's kind of the worst thing ever in your test suite. It gives you a lot of false confidence, and trust me, you don't want false confidence, especially if you're gonna wear a mustache on stage. You gotta have real confidence. Okay, all right, so anyway, if we go into this test here, we can see that we're not using create quietly here, right? We're still using create. But we are indeed faking the event system. So what's going on here? Well, I'll save us a little trouble. You can throw in a bunch of var dumps or DDs or fire off some arrays, but the issue here is that our code is actually executing twice. It's executing once with the factory, and then it's executing again when we dispatch the job on that next grayed out line. But our test is being satisfied because both of them result in a state of the application where our assertions pass, right? So, got a couple options here. We could do create quietly as we've done before. But the exception here, and the reason I want to point this out, is that anytime you have an event-driven system and you're going to use the event fake in your test, I recommend putting it up top. Make it be the first thing that happens inside of your test case, and that way, again, you are and want to be in control of that through the life cycle of your test. And if you need to let certain events fire or have certain events not fire, you can do just like we did with that job. We can say, fake everything except for the post-created event if we want that to happen, or vice versa. Fake everything, but these certain events that maybe we need to fire to set up our application in a certain way. So both of these are perfectly valid options again, and they're gonna result in still a passing test, but passing for the right reasons. Okay, let's move on to the final example here. the final facade I want to look at, a bit of a more modern facade, if you will. If we dig down into that language AI service class, kind of the last piece, I have this real naive implementation here that basically, as long as you don't say facades suck, your post isn't going to be censored in our blog. You can post anything else that you want. It's probably not the best approach. So let's use the HTTP facade to fire off some kind of call to vehicles AI and have it tell us if it's good or not to allow this post, right? And we're going to use the HTTP facade, or more technically, the HTTP client. And again, so long as we get a successful response, then this post is good. Now, when we run our test suite, this all passes. And just like before with the mail and the jobs, it's because, well, it's actually sending off that HTTP request in our test suite. Now, that might be good for some things, but it's probably not very good, again, for these language AI calls, because you're probably you have usage limits, or you pay for usage. And it's probably not good if you're, say, for example, traveling to Laracon, working on your slides, and you don't have Wi-Fi. You want to make sure that your test suite is actually able to pass. So let's fake this out. And one of the nice things I like to do with the HTTP facade, and what's different than from some of the others, is that in our base test case class, anytime I have an application that's using the HTTP facade, I like to go in here, add the setup method, and particularly add this HTTP prevent stray requests. This is, again, wonderfully named method. And what this is going to do is automatically set up this to be an HTTP fake, but more importantly, it's going to put it in a state where it behaves more like a mock. Going back to Fowler's definitions, it's going to throw an exception if you send off requests that haven't been faked yet, okay? Prevent stray requests. Wonderful. So now if we run our test suite, we're going to get a bunch of exceptions thrown in our application. What I also really, really like about this, other than the fact that it kind of avoids some of the foot guns we've been seeing before, is that it gives us this kind of like tracer bullet into our system and shows us and illuminates these areas that, again, we might not have expected to actually be running. For example, the post controller, this index action, I don't even know why that's sending off an HTTP request, but according to our tests and our failures here, it is. So I think it's really cool to kind of illuminate those aspects. I really like this method. I think Tim McDonald introduced this, or Tim Mac, but I'd like to see more of these. I think it'd be really cool to have something like mail prevent stray outgoing, right? Or bus prevent stray dispatches. These types of methods would help avoid the scenario that we've been seeing in some of these slides. So Tim Mac, maybe you can pair up with JMac. We can get this going out there. I don't know. Let me know. All right, let's take a look at the fake real quick. This is pretty straightforward stuff. We've seen it before. The only difference here is that the HTTP fake takes a key value pair. And the key here is the URI pattern, and the value is whatever you want the HTTP response to be. So in this case, there's some helper methods on that facade. We can just get back an empty 200 response. And of course, we could control it for our SAD path of sending back some kind of non-200 response. And both of these are going to result in passing tests for that particular service class. But the issue here is that we still have our failures in the broader test suite. So let's finish up with these. If we go back to that job where most of these exceptions are being thrown, it's because here is where we're actually calling that service class, that analyze method. Now, again, we could, in this job, or the test for this job, just use HTTP fake. But much like before, I don't want to reach for those fakes if I don't have to. It's super powerful stuff. Again, I don't always want to be responsible. It creates some of these loopholes that we've been seeing. In addition, I'm not calling the HTTP fake here, and I kind of like to make this rule that I only want to test the code in front of me. So if this isn't using the HTTP facade, I don't want to use the HTTP facade in my test. We have another way. In fact, we have this hook right here through the dependency injection where language service class is being passed in. So let's test this in kind of a traditional way and go down the line here. Before I send off that dispatch call, I can kind of add this block of code. And what this is doing is it's calling mockery, and it's creating a mock of that language AI type. It's stubbing out the analyze method that when it receives post body, it's going to return true, happy path scenario. And then finally, I'm going to swap that out in the container. So that way, anytime the language AI class is being resolved from the container, in this case through that dependency injection, it's going to now use my mock. Great. This works, it passes. It's a little verbose, right? So there's a helper, of course, that Laravel gives us, so we don't have to think about mockery and the container and all that stuff. We can streamline this with this helper, mock. It makes it a little more explicit of what it is. Again, perfectly in line with Fowler's definitions. And we can set up that expectation on it. When we run this, everything passes. We're happy. Okay, I've got 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Let's get a little spicy here. Let's go back into our handle method. Anytime I see dependency injection in Laravel, I just kind of, again, it doesn't feel right. There are places for it, but it really doesn't feel right if people are like dependency injecting like the underlying facade class or these kind of simple service classes. So let's take this out. And instead, what I'd really like to do is call this statically. I mean, it would be really symmetrical with the code I have here. It'd be really cool to just say like language AI analyze, kind of just like that publish post dispatch that we see down there. That code just, I don't know, feels a little more Laravel to me. I know what you're thinking. You're like, JMac, you can't just call an instance method statically. Yeah, I can, okay? If we scroll up to the top, it's not just because of the mustache. I can't. If I add 8 characters to this import, if I prefix it with facades, I have what Laravel now calls a real-time facade. And again, this has been around since Laravel 5.4. This isn't new stuff. What's really awesome about this is it takes that service class and makes it behave just like a facade. I don't have to make some kind of facade accessor. I don't have to make some kind of contract. I don't have to put it in my app service container. I don't have to alias it in my app config. I can just use it like a facade. I can call it statically. But more importantly, I can go back to my test. I can change that import and prefix it with facades. And now I can treat it and test it just like a facade. So in this case, I can say language AI expects, and now I can create a mock just like I was doing before. But again, super trim, super Laravel. And just like fake, if we core dive, this exists down in the root facade class. And as we can see here, it does the same thing as before. It just sets up that mock for us, and it automatically delegates down to mockeries expect. So that's pretty awesome. And we're passing, but we're passing with style now, right? Okay, one last little PSA. I got just another second here. There's a difference. This goes back to those definitions before. Right now, we're saying expects. But what's been around longer, since 5.0, and what's more broadly used even out in the PHP community, is should receive. And there's a difference here, and it's not just in the semantics, right? Expects kind of is like must, right? Whereas should receive is kind of like, meh, you can do that, but you don't have to. Like, we can do a little bit better than this. And here's that difference between what Fowler talked about being a stub versus a mock. A stub is just a canned response, whereas a mock's going to verify it. Let me show you what I mean. Let's jump down. Let's comment out that call to language AI, and let's just give this some kind of value that's going to make this test pass. And sure enough, it does. There's no exception being thrown. This passes. And again, we're back to that false confidence place, and we don't want to be there. So don't use should receive. That's demoting yourself to that stub status. You want to use expects, because with expects, it now becomes a mock, and you're getting that verification. It's being just a bit stricter. And now when we run our tests, we get an exception. Pretty wordy exception, but again, if we listened to Joel earlier, read through this, and it says, method analyze should be called exactly once, but called 0 times, right? So that's kind of the underlying point of this whole talk, right? Be explicit, right? Make sure your code's behaving the way you want. Nothing more, nothing less. Especially when you're using these facades, right? Often for one little method change or one additional assertion, you can go from that false confidence that we've been seeing to total confidence, right? These facades, they're super powerful, right? They're a core fundamental pattern within Laravel. Let's embrace them, right? I don't know, maybe if you do, someday you might have your own Lambo. Or is it all just a facade? I don't really know. What I do know is my name's JMac. This was What the Fake. I've got a repo out there. You can scan the QR code. I'll leave this up for a second. But please come chat with me during the break. Let's talk about testing. Let's talk about shift. And to that point, keep shifting.
Nice job.
Thank you.
All right, I got a question for you. I feel like
Not
you
about the
have, not about the stash.
Thanks.
Yeah, no good questions there. I feel like you have a really pragmatic approach to testing. You mentioned TDD, and you're like, if you're doing that, that's great.
Yeah.
You mentioned 100% coverage, and you're like, if you need that, that's great. So what is your approach to testing, and has that shifted over the years as you've grown your code base?
Not really. It hasn't shifted. No, but I would say for me, tests are about confidence for me. If I don't need to write a bunch of tests just to reach a metric per se. That doesn't mean if I have it, that's great. Mm-hmm. But it's really about making sure, again, the application's behaving the way I expect it and I need it to behave. And I kind of start with the things that give me most confidence. For Shift, it's the checkout, it's the dispatching of the job to make sure things run. Those things I care most about. I'm not too worried about the homepage looking a certain way, right? That's great if I can do it quick, but that's not where I start. I start with the stuff that's going to give me the biggest bang for the buck instead of seeking the coverage or TDDing it out, right? Because
stuff that helps you sleep at night.
Stuff that helps me sleep at night, yes. And of course, with kids, I have limited time anyways nowadays. So again, the most bang for the buck is what I'm about.
I hear that. Okay, everybody, say thanks to JMatt.
Thank you.